The radio crackled with static, then silence. Captain Michael Brennan pressed his back against the crumbling wall of the compound, dust coating his Kevlar, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his thigh. Around him, 11 soldiers breathed in shallow gasps, their ammunition nearly spent, their water gone. The Taliban had them surrounded in the Helmand Valley, a place so remote that even the birds seemed to avoid it. 3 hours ago, they'd called for air support. 3 hours ago, they'd been told help was coming. But the sky remained empty, a vast dome of indifferent blue that stretched from horizon to horizon like a broken promise. Brennan checked his watch. 15 minutes of ammo left, maybe 20 if they made every shot count. He'd lost 2 men already, their bodies covered with ponchos in the courtyard. He could hear the insurgents repositioning, their voices carrying across the poppy fields, confident and unhurried. They knew what trapped prey looked like. Then someone whispered a name. Widow, just that. Just the call sign, spoken like a prayer or a ghost story. Brennan had heard it before, in the mess halls and briefing rooms, always with that particular inflection that meant controversy. The pilot who'd lost her husband to friendly fire over Kandahar. The one who'd requested to stay in theater when everyone expected her to go home. The one Brass kept grounded for months because of some bureaucratic nonsense about psychological fitness. She flew A-10 Warthogs, the ugly, brutal machines that grunt soldiers loved and officers tolerated. But she'd been grounded. Everyone knew that. So why were his men whispering her call sign like it meant salvation? All stations, this is Widowon, I have eyes on your position. The voice cut through the radio static, calm and precise, with the faintest hint of a southern accent. Brennan grabbed the handset so hard his knuckles went white. Widowon, this is Viper 6. We are danger close, I repeat danger close, enemy within 50 meters. We are at black on ammo. He didn't get to finish. The sound reached them first, a noise that didn't belong to the desert silence. Low and guttural, like a mechanical growl rolling down from the heavens. Brennan looked up and saw it. A gray cross emerging from the sun's glare, wings level, nose pointed directly at their compound. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, ungainly and beautiful, its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its 7-barrel GAU-8 cannon visible beneath the cockpit like the fang of some prehistoric beast. Lieutenant Eva Riordan, call sign Widow, had broken every regulation in the book to get here. She'd been grounded for 47 days. Her flight status revoked pending a psychological evaluation that kept getting postponed because the evaluator was deployed elsewhere. But when the call came through on the emergency channel, when she heard Viper 6's coordinates and the desperation bleeding through military formality, she'd made a decision. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Kowalski, had looked at her across the flight line and simply said, "I didn't see nothing." 10 minutes later, Widowon was wheels up, flying nap of the earth through valleys that weren't on her flight plan, her AN/AAQ-28 LITENING targeting pod scanning the terrain ahead. She'd known this was career suicide. She'd known they might court-martial her. She hadn't cared. The voice on the radio sounded like her husband's had, that last transmission before the bomb fell, before the coordinates were wrong, before everything ended. She wouldn't let that happen again. The A-10 came in low, maybe 200 feet, and Brennan watched as the pilot rolled slightly to bring her cannon to bear. The aircraft's titanium bathtub, the armored cockpit that protected the pilot, glinted in the afternoon sun. Then the GAU-8 opened up. The sound was unlike anything else in modern warfare, a deep, tearing BRRRT that seemed to shake the air itself, each burst firing 70 rounds per second of 30mm depleted uranium. The ground erupted 50 meters from the compound wall. Dirt, rock, and bodies flew skyward in a choreographed violence that was almost beautiful in its precision. The Taliban fighters who'd been advancing scattered, some too slow, caught in the cone of destruction that the Warthog's gun delivered with surgical accuracy. Widow made her first pass in 4 seconds, then pulled up hard, the General Electric turbofan screaming as she climbed, rolled, and came around for another run. Brennan's radio crackled. "Viper 6, stay down, I'm coming back." The second pass was even lower. Riordan could see the enemy positions clearly now through her targeting pod, the thermal signatures of bodies behind walls, the hot barrels of PKM machine guns. She selected one of her AGM-65 Mavericks, designated the target, and fired. The missile leapt from the rail under her wing, its rocket motor igniting with a flash, and tracked straight to the building where the enemy commander had been coordinating the assault. The explosion was precise, contained, professional. When the smoke cleared, that entire section of the Taliban position was silent. She keyed her mic. "Viper 6, how copy?" Brennan's voice came back stronger now, steadied by hope. "Good hits, Widow 1, outstanding hits. We've got movement breaking off to the north." She was already adjusting her approach, her hands steady on the stick despite the fact that her career was likely over. The A-10 responded like an extension of her will, heavy and stable, a platform built to survive the worst that ground fire could offer. She'd taken AAA fire over Fallujah, had brought her bird back with holes you could put your fist through. This was what she was made for. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was never meant to be pretty. Built by Fairchild Republic in the 70s around that massive GAU-8 cannon, it was slow, subsonic, ugly as sin. But it could loiter over a battlefield for hours, could take punishment that would down any other aircraft, and could deliver close air support with a precision that made it beloved by ground forces and disparaged by Air Force brass who wanted fast jets and stealth technology. Riordan loved it like some people loved old dogs, with an affection born of reliability and shared trauma. Her A-10 bore her husband's initials under the canopy rail, small letters in black that nobody else noticed. She touched them before every flight. Today she'd touched them twice. The Taliban broke. It wasn't dramatic, not like in movies. They simply stopped fighting, melting back into the landscape, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. Widow made 2 more passes, lower each time, daring them to shoot, begging them to give her a target. But the fight was over. She climbed to 3,000 feet and circled, watching the compound through her pod, watching Brennan's men slowly emerge from cover, watching them wave. One soldier pulled off his helmet and just stared up at her aircraft, and even from 3,000 feet she could sense the emotion, the relief, the gratitude. Her radio came alive with voices. "Widow 1, Viper 6, you saved our lives." She didn't know what to say. For 47 days she'd been told she wasn't fit to fly, that her judgment was compromised, that she needed more time. For 47 days she'd sat in her quarters staring at the picture of Daniel in his flight suit, remembering his smile, his terrible jokes, the way he'd called her Evie when no one else was around. She keyed the mic, her voice flat, professional. "Viper 6, Widow 1, QRF is en route. ETA 20 minutes, I'll remain on station." "Copy that," Brennan said, and then, breaking protocol entirely, "Thank you." Back at Bagram, the shitstorm was already brewing. Colonel Hastings, the wing commander, had been notified the moment Widow 1's transponder showed up in restricted airspace. He'd immediately known what happened, had felt equal parts fury and resignation. Riordan had been one of his best pilots before the incident. Before she'd watched her husband's F-16 disappear in a fireball because some JTAC read the wrong grid coordinates. Before she'd spiraled into a grief so profound that 3 different chaplains had tried and failed to reach her. He'd grounded her not because he doubted her skills, but because he'd seen the look in her eyes, the hollow distance that spoke of someone not entirely present. Now she'd stolen an aircraft, violated her grounding, and flown unauthorized into an active combat zone. He should have been furious. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to pride. When Widow 1 touched down 90 minutes later, there was a reception committee waiting. 2 MPs, 3 senior officers, and a crowd of maintenance crew who'd somehow heard what happened. Riordan shut down the engines, the turbofans winding down with that distinctive whistle, and popped the canopy. The desert air hit her face, hot and dry. She climbed down slowly, her flight suit dark with sweat, her hands steady despite knowing what came next. Colonel Hastings approached first. He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, then said, "Captain Riordan, you're confined to quarters pending investigation." She nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned to leave, then stopped, looked back. That was some exceptional flying today. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. The story spread through Bagram like wildfire, then to Kandahar, then to every forward operating base and theater. The pilot who'd been grounded, who'd lost everything, who'd stolen a warthog and saved 11 men. In the retelling it grew, became something larger than fact, became mythology. The maintenance crews started leaving small tributes by her aircraft, challenge coins, unit patches, photographs of soldiers she'd never met. Someone painted a small widow spider on the nose, black and elegant. The brass tried to control the narrative, but you can't contain something that speaks to the heart of what soldiers believe about loyalty, sacrifice, and what it means to have someone's back. Riordan sat in her quarters and read the charges: unauthorized use of military equipment, violation of direct orders, reckless endangerment. Each one carried the potential for court-martial, discharge, imprisonment. She felt nothing. Or rather, she felt something so close to peace that it frightened her. For 47 days she'd been drowning. For 4 hours today she'd been flying. The investigation took 3 weeks. They interviewed everyone: Kowalski, who claimed he'd been in the latrine when the aircraft launched; Brennan, who testified via video link from Germany where they'd medevaced him for surgery on his leg; the other pilots who swore they'd heard nothing unusual on the radios; even the tower controller who suddenly couldn't remember clearing anyone for takeoff during that particular window. The investigators knew they were being stonewalled. They also knew that Viper 6's entire squad had survived because of Riordan's unauthorized flight. The optics were impossible. The Pentagon wanted it to disappear quietly. Colonel Hastings called her to his office on a Tuesday morning. Riordan wore her dress uniform, buttons polished, ribbons straight, prepared for whatever judgment came. The colonel sat behind his desk, a thin folder before him. "Captain Riordan, the investigation has concluded. Due to the exceptional circumstances and the successful outcome of your actions, Command has decided to issue a letter of reprimand rather than pursue court-martial." She exhaled slowly. A letter of reprimand was career death, but it wasn't prison. "However," Hastings continued, "effective immediately, your flight status is reinstated. You're assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron Close Air Support Operations." She looked at him, confused. "Sir, I don't understand. A letter of reprimand will sit in your file," he said, "where it will be seen by every promotion board for the rest of your career. You'll probably never make major. You'll certainly never make colonel, but you'll fly." He leaned back. "Command needs pilots who understand what's at stake, who will break rules when breaking rules is the only right thing to do. Just don't make me regret this." Riordan flew 97 more combat missions over the next 8 months. She escorted convoys through Wardek Province, provided overwatch for Special Forces operations in the Korangal Valley, and twice more arrived at danger-close situations where her presence meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. The other pilots watched her with a mixture of respect and wariness, not quite sure how to categorize someone who'd committed career suicide and somehow survived. But the ground forces knew. When Widow One checked in on frequency, there was an audible relief in the controllers' voices, a sense that the cavalry had arrived. She became the pilot everyone requested, the call sign that meant safety. Her A-10 accumulated battle damage, bullet holes patched with speed tape, scorch marks from near misses with RPGs, and she refused to let maintenance replace the nose art, the black widow spider that had become her unofficial insignia. She told herself she was just doing her job, just fulfilling her obligation. But late at night, alone in her quarters, she'd look at Daniel's picture and whisper, "I'm still here, I'm still fighting," as though her survival was penance for his death. Captain Michael Brennan rotated home in January. He spent 6 months at Walter Reed recovering from his injuries, enduring surgeries to repair the nerve damage in his leg, learning to walk without a limp. He attended the memorial services for the 2 men who died in that compound, stood at attention as taps played, and felt the survivor's guilt that never quite fades. But he also wrote letters to his congressmen, to Stars and Stripes, to anyone who might listen, about the pilot who'd saved his squad. He detailed the impossible precision of her attack runs, the calmness of her voice under pressure, the way she'd circled overhead until the QRF arrived, burning fuel she probably didn't have just to make sure they were safe. Most of his letters went unanswered. But one reached the desk of a journalist who specialized in military affairs, and suddenly the story was public, and the Air Force could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. The feature article ran in the Washington Post on a Sunday. The Widow's War: How a Grounded Pilot Became a Legend, with a photograph of Riordan standing beside her A-10, helmet under her arm, expression neutral. The piece was thorough, detailing her record before Daniel's death, the commendations, the exemplary fitness reports, the reputation as one of the finest close air support pilots in theater. It covered the incident that killed her husband with painful specificity, the way friendly fire investigations always leave more questions than answers, and it described that day in Helmand with cinematic detail, quoting Brennan extensively, making it clear that 11 American soldiers were alive because Eva Riordan had decided rules mattered less than lives. The Air Force Public Affairs Office issued a terse statement. Captain Riordan is a valued member of our combat aviation forces. Her actions, while irregular, reflected the courage and initiative we expect from our airmen. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug, neither condemnation nor praise, perfect in its ambiguity. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into Bagram addressed simply to Widow or the A-10 pilot. Packages arrived containing everything from hand-knit scarves to bottles of bourbon to children's drawings of airplanes shooting bad guys. Veterans groups requested her presence at events. Defense contractors wanted to feature her in recruitment materials. She declined everything, maintained her silence, kept flying. But the mythology grew beyond her control. Soldiers started getting tattoos of widow spiders. Someone made a challenge coin with her call sign. At a FOB in Kunar province, a lieutenant named Tors told his platoon before every patrol, "Don't worry, Widow's got us." Even though she was 300 miles away and might not even be airborne. It became a talisman, a superstition, a belief that somewhere in the sky was a guardian who wouldn't let them die alone. Riordan heard about these things secondhand and felt a crushing weight of responsibility. She wasn't a hero. She was just a pilot trying to outrun grief. Daniel had been killed on a Tuesday morning, during a mission so routine that he joked about it before takeoff. "Just another milk run, Evie," he'd said, kissing her before walking to his F-16. The JTAC had called in a strike on a suspected weapons cache, had transmitted coordinates that were off by 600 meters. Daniel had dropped his GBU-12 exactly where ordered. The warehouse had exploded. Only later did they discover the warehouse was empty, and the actual target, a school the Taliban was using as a headquarters, was untouched. 600 meters. That's all that separated success from tragedy, precision from catastrophe. The investigation cleared Daniel posthumously, blamed the JTAC for negligent coordinate verification, issued new protocols. But he was still dead, and Eva was still alive, and the distance between those two facts seemed unbridgeable. She'd requested to stay in theater because going home meant facing an empty house, an empty bed, a future that had evaporated in one moment of someone else's mistake. Flying was the only time she felt anything close to peace. Her deployment was scheduled to end in March, but she extended. Hastings approved it without comment. Most pilots counted down the days until they could leave Afghanistan, could return to air conditioning and real food and the illusion of safety. Riordan counted missions, each one another day she didn't have to think about what came next. The A-10 fleet was aging, and there was perpetual talk of retiring the platform, replacing it with multi-role fighters that could do everything but, critics argued, did nothing as well. The debate raged in Congress and the Pentagon, budgetary concerns versus battlefield effectiveness, modernity versus proven reliability. Every time Riordan flew, every time she brought someone home alive, she felt like she was proving something larger than her own worth. She was proving that the ugly, slow, outdated Warthog was still the best close air support platform ever built. She was proving that sometimes the old ways were the right ways. She was proving that loyalty and skill mattered more than politics and progress. In June, she flew her 100th combat mission. The maintenance crew threw an impromptu celebration on the flight line, complete with a cake that someone had bribed the mess hall to make. Riordan stood amid the cheering airmen and officers, feeling distant, like she was watching the scene through glass. Kowalski presented her with a plaque, a piece of shrapnel mounted on wood with an engraved plate. Widow 100 combat missions, they all came home. She accepted it with a nod, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. That night alone, she finally cried for the first time since Daniel died. Not from grief, though that was there, but from a strange, fragile gratitude that her life still had purpose, that she could still save people, that somehow her broken pieces had been reforged into something useful. The tears fell silently, and when they stopped, she felt lighter, as though some burden she'd been carrying had finally been set down. She looked at Daniel's picture and whispered, "I'm going to be okay," and almost believed it. The war ground on. Riordan flew through summer and fall, through sandstorms and clear skies, through missions that were routine and missions that demanded every ounce of her skill. She learned the terrain intimately, could identify wadis and villages from their topographic signatures alone. She developed an almost supernatural ability to read battlefields, to sense where the danger was before it manifested, to position herself where she could respond fastest. The JTACs loved her because she understood their language, their urgency, their fear. When she checked in on frequency, they knew they were talking to someone who'd been where they were, who'd lost someone to the fog of war, who would move heaven and earth to bring them home. She didn't speak about her personal life, didn't socialize much, remained professional and distant. But in the air, with lives on the line, she was fully present in a way she couldn't manage on the ground. December brought orders for redeployment. The 354th was rotating stateside, replaced by another squadron. Riordan would have 3 weeks at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, then assigned to a training role, teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots. It was, everyone assured her, an honor. It felt like exile. The last mission was supposed to be ceremonial, a simple combat air patrol over a secure sector, a victory lap. But Afghanistan had never cared about supposed. 40 minutes into the flight, the radio erupted with a frantic call. A Chinook helicopter was down in the Tangi Valley, crew and passengers alive but under fire, medevac inbound but 20 minutes out. Widow 1 was the closest air support. Riordan didn't hesitate, rolled her A-10 onto a heading that would take her to the coordinates, and pushed the throttles forward. The Warthog accelerated, its maximum speed barely enough to be called fast, but she nursed every knot she could from the airframe. Below, the landscape blurred past, mountains giving way to valleys, snow-covered peaks to brown desert. The radio chatter was controlled chaos, voices overlapping, urgency bleeding through training. She cut through it all. All stations, Widow 1, 5 mics out. The Chinook lay on its side in a dried riverbed, rotor blades shattered, fuselage scarred with bullet impacts. Around it, the crew and the infantry squad they'd been transporting had established a defensive perimeter using the helicopter's bulk as cover. The Taliban fighters were in the hills, firing from elevated positions, pinning the Americans down. Riordan assessed the situation through her targeting pod, marking enemy positions, calculating angles of attack. This was the worst-case scenario: friendlies in a depression, enemies on the high ground, insufficient separation for most weapons. She'd have to go danger close, under 500 feet, thread her cannon fire between the rocks and the Americans. 1 degree off and she'd kill the people she was trying to save. She keyed her mic. "Ground element, Widow 1, confirm you're in defilade behind the helo. I'm coming in hot from the north." The response was immediate, grateful. "Widow 1, we copy, cleared hot." She rolled inverted, pulled through, and dove. The Warthog screamed down at an angle that would have terrified anyone who didn't understand its structural integrity. Riordan's hands were steady on the stick, her eyes switching between the pod display and visual reference, her mind calculating lead and deflection, and the million variables that separated precision from massacre. At 800 feet she leveled, designated her first target and fired. The GAU-8 roared, sending a stream of depleted uranium downrange at 3,900 feet per second. Rocks exploded, dust erupted, and the Taliban position ceased to exist. She pulled up, cleared the ridgeline by maybe 50 feet, felt the airframe shudder as something, small arms fire probably pinged off her armor. Didn't matter. She was already coming around for the next pass. The enemy tried to adjust to track her, but the A-10's profile was deceptive, its slow speed and heavy armor making it a harder target than faster jets. She fired again, walked her rounds across another position, silenced another machine gun. The ground element was cheering on the radio, but she blocked it out, focused only on the next target, the next threat. She made 6 passes in 10 minutes, expending 500 rounds in her remaining Mavericks, systematically eliminating every enemy position she could identify. By the time the medevac Blackhawks arrived, the valley was quiet, smoke rising from a dozen points in the hillside. Riordan circled overhead, watching the wounded being loaded, watching the Chinook crew being extracted, watching until every American was airborne and headed to safety. Only then did she turn for home, her fuel gauge lower than she'd like, her ammunition exhausted, her hands starting to shake with the adrenaline come down. The radio was silent for a long moment, then the medevac pilot's voice. "Widow 1, Dust Off 3, you just saved 23 lives. I don't know how to thank you." She did what she always did, kept her voice professional, emotionless. "Dust Off 3, Widow 1, just doing my job. Safe flight home." But inside she felt something crack, some final wall between herself and acceptance. This was who she was now. This was what she was meant to do, and maybe, finally, that was enough. The ceremony at Bagram was larger than she'd expected. The entire wing turned out, formation perfect in their dress uniforms under a cold December sky. General Morrison flew in from Qatar specifically to present the awards. Riordan stood at attention as he read the citations: Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Valor device, campaign ribbons she'd already earned. But the words that mattered came after, when Morrison stepped closer and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Captain, I've read your file, all of it. What happened to your husband was a tragedy. What you've done since is extraordinary. The Air Force needs more pilots like you, people who understand that the mission is about the person on the ground, not the medals or the promotions." He paused. "You're going to train the next generation. Teach them that. Teach them what it means to have someone's back. Teach them that sometimes breaking the rules is the most honorable thing you can do." She nodded, not trusting her voice. The general stepped back, saluted, and she returned it, sharp and precise. The formation erupted in applause, and for the first time in 18 months, Eva Riordan smiled. Nellie's Air Force Base was a different world: permanent buildings, organized streets, the rhythms of peacetime military life. Riordan reported to the 66th Weapons Squadron, where she'd be an instructor in the weapons school, teaching advanced tactics to experienced pilots. The students were cocky, confident, the best of the best from their squadrons. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She was younger than most instructors, her rank modest, her demeanor quiet. Then someone looked up her record, saw the combat missions, saw the commendations, saw the newspaper article. The whispers started immediately. "That's her. That's Widow." Suddenly the students sat straighter in her briefings, took notes with renewed attention, asked questions that weren't about showing off but about learning. She taught them weapons employment, battlefield geometry, calm procedures under stress. But she also taught them the things that weren't in the manual: how to read a ground commander's voice for panic, how to prioritize targets when everything is screaming for attention, how to balance aggression with caution. And most importantly, she taught them that their purpose wasn't to be heroes. It was to bring people home. One afternoon, during a training exercise over the Nevada test range, one of her students, a captain named Rodriguez, made an aggressive gun run that strayed too close to the simulated friendlies. Riordan's voice cut through the radio, calm but absolute. "Rodriguez, Widow 1, break right, you're inside the safety ring." He pulled off, embarrassed, and when they landed, she took him aside. You flew like you had something to prove, like you were thinking about how it would look in the debrief. She fixed him with a stare that had seen things he couldn't imagine. Every time you fly combat, remember that someone on the ground is counting on you to be perfect. Their kid is waiting for them to come home. Their spouse is planning their welcome back dinner. You don't get to be aggressive. You don't get to show off. You get to be precise and careful and absolutely merciless when the situation calls for it. But you never, ever forget that you're someone's last hope. Rodriguez nodded, chastened. Word of that conversation spread, became part of the widow mythology, the instructor who cared more about her students' character than their airmanship. Eva Riordan served as an instructor for 3 years, shaping a generation of A-10 pilots who carried her lessons to deployments worldwide. She never spoke about that day in Helmand unless directly asked, and even then she was brief, factual, unemotional. But the legend persisted, grew, became something larger than one pilot's unauthorized flight. The A-10 community adopted the Black Widow Spider as an unofficial symbol, a reminder that sometimes the small, the underestimated, the supposedly obsolete could be the most lethal. When the Air Force finally attempted to retire the Warthog fleet in 2028, veterans groups and active-duty soldiers staged a public campaign, and Eva's story was at its center. The pilot who'd proven that close air support wasn't about technology, but about trust, skill, and the willingness to put yourself between danger and the people who needed you. The program survived barely, funded for another decade. Eva heard about it on the news and allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. She'd saved more than lives. She'd saved a legacy. In 2030, she made major, the letter of reprimand in her file finally overridden by sheer accumulation of excellence. In 2032, she took command of a squadron. And in 2034, on a quiet Tuesday that echoed another Tuesday 13 years earlier, she submitted her retirement papers. She'd given the Air Force 20 years, and they'd given her purpose when she'd had none, community when she'd been alone, and a way to transform grief into something that mattered. She flew her final sortie on a cloudless afternoon, a simple training mission with no drama, no ceremony, just the familiar weight of the stick in her hand and the Nevada desert passing below. When she landed and shut down the engines for the last time, she sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the cooling turbofans, feeling the heat radiating from the airframe. Then she placed her hand on the cockpit rail, next to Daniel's initials, and whispered, "We did good." She climbed down, walked away, and didn't look back. The Black Widow Spider on the nose watched her go, wings folded, waiting for the next pilot who would need courage, who would need to remember that sometimes the smallest, strangest things are exactly what saves us when everything else fails.